Good evening, everybody. Just doing a recap on the Where We Sow Conditions of the Heart Bible Study. And I just wanted to um, just talk about a few different things in here in the recap. One of the things that we talked about were the many different ways that we can sow. Um, one of the ways that we can sow is through our money. Another way we can sow is through our time, and another way we can sow is through our talent. And not that they need to be ranked in any sort of order. I know many of us look at money and think that's the main way or the only way that we can sow. But I'm inclined to believe that when we're sowing with our time, that really shows where our heart is. Now you want to pay attention to that word because we're going to dive into that a little bit more as well. Um, and then your talent, that makes me think of it from a practical standpoint, from a job. When we're on the jobs that we have, we're typically hired because we have a talent, because we have a skill. And based on those things, that determines our pay sometimes. It determines what we'd like to call our professional worth. So those are just a few different ways to sow. In Mark 4, we looked at the sower and where he sowed, or should we say where the seeds that he sowed fell. And this is also called conditions of the heart because of the locations of where the four different seeds went. Okay, we know that one of the places that the seeds went was by the wayside. We know another one was on stony ground. We know another one was in the thorns. And lastly, we know that the last seed was sown on good ground. Somebody say good ground because I don't know about you, but I want every seed that God sows to be sown on the good ground of my life. Okay, but we need to pay attention that the good ground simply is where our heart is. Okay, the conditions of our heart. All four are conditions of our hearts. Okay, so some of the things that we talked about was really when our heart is not in the right place that we make bad decisions. Okay, many of us have made bad decisions because our heart wasn't in the right place. Maybe that was just a decision where we allowed ourselves and our hearts to be displaced from God in that particular moment. Or maybe that's just the state that we're in where our hearts are just not right at all with God, and therefore we're making a string of bad decisions. Okay, we saw that with David and Bathsheba. We know David was a man after God's very own heart, but he allowed himself to be displaced. And as he was displaced, he made bad decisions. Okay. Another thing is that the heart and the spirit coincide with one another. Okay. We showed some scriptures that really kind of talked about our heart and our spirit. Okay. That they really do great things when they coincide. Okay. But another thing we talked about is that the two are not the same. And being as though the two are not the same, that means that when they're not aligned correctly, that we have to do what we need to do in order to get them to be aligned with God again. Okay. But we know also that once we get them aligned, the spirit and our heart, great things can happen. Okay, we read so many different scriptures, and at the end I'm going to go over a few. Well, really, I'll just kind of, as it's a recap, just kind of give them to you to read, and I hope that you be diligent in doing so. All right. But another thing that we looked at is that we can be led wrongly by our hearts. Okay, which is all the reason why we say our hearts need to be in the right place, because we can do everything with our heart. Or sometimes people say follow your heart, but if your heart is not after the things of God, what are we really following? Okay, so just to go over a few scriptures, when we say that we can be led wrongly by our hearts, Matthew 6:21, when we say that our hearts and our spirit are not the same, but when aligned with the Spirit of God, wonderful things happen. Psalm 73 and 26, and Proverbs 3, 3 to 5. When we also said that the heart and the spirit coincide with one another, a few different scriptures for that. We've got Deuteronomy 30 and 6, Ezekiel 19 and 20, Galatians 5, 16 through 8. And again, when we talked about our hearts, when they're not in the right place, that we make bad decisions. And you can take a look at Proverbs 3, 5 through 6, and then 2 Samuel 11. All right. But lastly, as we conclude, we know that Proverbs 4:23 tells us to keep our hearts with all diligence, because out of it flows the issues of life. So maybe our heart's conditions are tied into how well we manage our hearts, what we sow and where we sow, because the what we sow is just as important as where we're sowing it. Okay. And we know that the heart is a very important organ for us. Okay. It determines life, but it's the same spiritually. Our hearts really determine our spiritual life. Okay. So I just want to be clear also that this message does not imply that we won't make mistakes. We saw that David did that, but once he got back in alignment with God, as we saw in Psalm 51, things turned out for the good for him and for his family. So I just want to say God bless you all. And hey, again, we just talked about and just did a recap on where we sow, but the conditions of the heart. God bless you.